Hello, everybody, and welcome to Church at Home with Rachel for Wednesday, the 29th of November. I'd like to share with you a short passage, a paragraph I read yesterday in my daily office as I was reading from Common Prayer, a liturgy for ordinary radicals. And it really struck me because I am an avid reader. I love to read. I love prayers and books. I love reading books about theology. I love reading anything I can get my hands on. And so the written word is a huge part of my life. You can see the mess behind me. I have books everywhere. There's books over here too, shelves everywhere um, that are going to be a bit of a pain to move, but a glorious pain to move. But I got, the written word is a balm to my soul. It's such an important part of my life. And I read this. Erasmus of Rotterdam, a 16th century priest who was committed to reforming the church from within, said, "When faith came to be in writings rather than in hearts, contention grew hot and love grew cold. That which is forced cannot be sincere, and that which is not voluntary cannot please Christ." When I first read that, I thought, oh, what's he saying here? When faith came to be in writings rather than in hearts, contention grew hot and love grew cold. And at first I was like, well, wait a minute. We have scripture and it tells us about Christ, and scripture is so important, and that's the written word. And then I got thinking about what happens when we make those arguments. Because, well, absolutely, yes, I believe in the written word. But I was reminded last weekend when we were doing gospel-based discipleship and listening to the gospel being spoken. And although it was written out, and usually I read, if they hand me a copy of the scripture, I will read it along with the person who's speaking. And I don't always hear everybody if they're quiet. But this time, for whatever reason, I kept closing my eyes and listening. I think partly it's because of the way that we're called to listen to the scripture, that you're to pay attention for a word or a phrase that stands out for you. And so I was listening. Each time I listened to the gospel passage. And in the listening, we hear the words as they were meant to be. I like to write. I like to write sermons. I like to write other things. I enjoy writing. But I often realize when I'm preaching those words that I have written that I don't write a sermon the way I write an essay or the way I write a letter. I write the way I speak. I have emphasis. I put in ... everywhere in my sermon when I want to remind myself to slow down, let people think about what they just heard. There's something really powerful about the spoken word. And even if it gets written down and then read again, there doesn't have to be anything lost. I think there's always a little bit lost in translation, that what you mean when you first utter it, whether it's when you speak it with your mouth or you write it on a piece of paper, that whatever's in our mind, whatever that brilliant idea was, whatever that 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 soul moving, soul changing part of what you're thinking, a little bit of it I think does get lost. That when we write it down, there aren't that many people, I think, in the world who are so very articulate that they are able to absolutely convey everything they're feeling and thinking and imagining in the words that they choose to use. That could be my inexperience with language and only knowing one really well. But there's something about putting something on paper that removes it from the source. And it makes it sort of subjective or objective. We can, no, I'm not, I'm not using the right words. I apologize. But when we put it on paper, it's in black and white. Anybody can read it. They can read it and interpret it as they like to see it. The other day, the preacher at the Eucharist talked about the word love. And that, you can love your spouse and you can love chocolate cake. And we know when we say this what we mean. But what about somebody who's just learning the language? They're learning English. They've never spoken English before, and they're learning by just being present in the community. And I turn around and say, I love my husband Rob and I really love a good chocolate chip cookie. What's to tell them that my use of the word love was two completely different things? Nothing. they're going to interpret that. They're quite possibly going to interpret that word love meaning both the same thing. And that might be rather confusing, that I would love my husband the way I love a chocolate chip cookie or vice versa. When we put things down in writing, I think we lose a little bit of the intent. Not that we're giving up the intent, because we place the intent in the words we write down. But when someone else then reads them, I think sometimes the intention gets lost. It's kind of like if I say to you the word barn, what do you picture? Probably, a building with 4 sides and a pitched roof. And what color is it? Is it green? Is it old, washed out gray of the wood? Is it red? What does the roof look like? Is it a tin roof? Is it an old shingled roof? Is it an old wooden roof? Does it have doors? Does it have one of the mounds that walks up and the door is sort of halfway up the wall and the mound builds up again so they could drive the hay mow into the hay wagon into the drive shed? Every one of us will probably have a little bit different understanding of that word barn. Same thing happens when we write things down. We write down a word and then it's open to interpretation for whoever will read it. Same thing when we speak it. But when we speak it, our inflection, our body language, all those things can contribute to that. But when we write something down, it doesn't have body language. It doesn't have inflection. It might not even have any context. And so I think I understood what he was saying when he says, when faith came to be in writings rather than in hearts, contention grew hot and love grew cold. That which is forced cannot be sincere, and that which is not voluntary cannot please Christ. I think that when we put things down in writing, it becomes, especially in our society, it becomes the law. This is formal. We can see it. It's in black and white. How many times have we heard somebody say, there it is, it's in black and white, meaning this is it. This is the truth. This is the way. And when we do that, we remove all emotion from it. We remove all possibility of gray or pink or green of it. It's all black and white. And when we do that, we lose something of what was originally intended. And I'm not saying that that's bad, but when we think about it, how many times have we had a good back and forth with somebody because of the way, like a frustrating, like, this is what I believe and I'm going to defend it to the death with somebody about how we see Jesus working in the world. And how often do we see that same kind of argument happening where it almost comes to fisticuffs because that's what it says in the Bible or in my Bible? When we start using, this isn't a Bible, but when we start using the text as the proof rather than Christ as the evidence, as the proof, we run into some problems. I think if we're walking with Christ, we are faced with a truth that's open-ended. We are faced with Jesus saying to us, what do you believe? How many times did he say to his disciples, this is actually what I meant? And how many times did he tell them a story, a parable, and that they had to figure out, they had to work through? And I bet you anything, for the 12 disciples that were with him when he said it, there were probably 12 different interpretations. And I don't necessarily think that one of them was right and the other 11 were wrong. I think that that's the thing about Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, that we interpret them in our own context and we understand them within the relationship we have with Jesus. And that allows us to have this opportunity to have a real living, breathing, growing covenant with God, with Jesus. Whereas when we stick to the scripture or we stick to the letter of the law, the black and white, we lose the possibility. We lose the other possible understandings. We lose the ability to say on one hand and on the other hand, and what do you think? And oh yeah, I understand that. Oh, I never thought of it that way before. Because not always, but a little too often we come down with, well, this is what it says. At the end of the argument or the end of the conversation, well, this is what it says in scripture. And then we can debate which scripture we're using. But this idea that something being written down can cause contention versus something that's coming from the heart. When faith came to be in writings rather than hearts, contention grew hot and love grew cold. I think we need to hang on to Scripture. We need to hang on to the writings and the teachings of the church fathers and all of the theologians who have gone before us and those who will come after us. But I think we also need to hold in great tension with that all the conversations and the simple experiences of being in the presence of Christ and allowing ourselves to be moved and to change and to reform opinions and be shaken and allowed to wake ourselves up to, wow, I never thought of it that way. Because I have a hunch that if Jesus were physically here with us, walking the road with us, we'd have a lot of those, wow, I never thought of it that way. I think my life just changed moments. Because when we come into relationship with Christ, I think it changes us in a way that simply if we leave our spiritual growth to reading books and the Scripture, it will change us, and I think it will help us, but I think it's missing that next step. The next step along the road. The next step of allowing our hearts to be warm and contention to cease. Thanks for joining me today. Have a great day. I'll see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachel for Thursday, the 30th of November. God bless everybody.